Hello, I hope you can hear me quite well. My name is Ádám Miklósi, and thank you much for inviting me to that wonderful event. I came here partly because I was also enjoying this possibility to talk about one of my passions, which is research on dogs. And I really think that this type of events are very important because in the last few years, science made huge advances in dog research, and really we want to share it. I mean, by we, I mean the scientists want to share it with other people who not just like dogs, but actually work for them and work with them together with dog owners and so forth. So actually, the talk that I want to present is sort of a response to what the first topic of this day is, which is talking about the origins of the dogs. And the question what I want to ask here is a little bit about how we conceptualize dogs today, and also, as I know the other speakers will also talk about the same issue. So just to make sure, because I'm coming from quite far, and maybe most people even don't know me and also don't know where I'm coming from, this first slide is just to indicate that actually I'm coming from Hungary, which is sort of the heart of Europe. The country has, even you can say, a heart-like form a little bit, and it's quite far from here, but we have also very nice venues there. So for example, the Danube and so on, and at the Danube bank, you can also find actually our department of ethology, which is on the 6th floor, which is not a natural place for a department that works on dogs, but we didn't have any choice for this. But for family dogs, actually, that's not a big problem. So when researchers visit us, they always ask, okay, and where do you keep your dogs? And I say, okay, we don't keep any dogs. We dogs are kept by our enthusiastic owners, or actually they're not our owners, but owners. And these owners are scattered around Budapest, and they visit us at the department, and then we can do our observations, tests, and so forth, and so on. So actually, it's not just about me, and it's not just about my opinion, what I will present here, and also the next few days about different topics, but actually we have established research group many years ago in 1994, which is, and the name of the research group is Family Dog Project. So it's not actually just about a dog, it's about a family, and the family is connected to humans. Usually we talk about humans as a form of a family organization. So this means that actually, as also our logo indicates, we are looking at, so the bottom line of our interest is looking at dog-human interaction from a various and different point of view. That might involve actually understanding of the history of these interactions, actually also incorporates the cognitive aspects of this interaction, but also we want to, and I hope I can underline that maybe not in this talk, but in the following talks tomorrow and the day after, that we also want to give some practical hints for those who are working with the dog-owner relationship, whether as a dog trainer or a behavior counselor or in other parts of this world. So these are the main points of our mission, and this is what I want to represent also here. Actually, I had to realize that probably I try to put in too much in my talks. That's usually the problem with my presentations. Now, there are two choices for me. One is to speed up the speaking, which I won't do, because even that level of speed is too much sometimes for me, and that's probably even more difficult for the audience to listen at. So what I will probably do is that I will leave out some parts of this presentation, and hopefully you can still get the whole picture. So that's why I'm using this strategy, what is is used by this famous American thriller series, you know, Columbo, where they actually show the scene before, so you actually know who the killer is, and then you just have to wait until the others also will know who the killer is, including the detective. So actually, I'm telling you the story now, but it is the bottom line. Maybe also that we can come back to these issues, and we can talk about this at the evening and the question-answer sessions, and then we will see how much we actually can provide the information for. So the three issues I wanted to attack or discuss here is the something about the evolution of dogs, and I know that other speakers will also contribute to this topic, so I want to present a little bit a provocative picture, and I think, in my view, there's little relevance to present understanding of dog behavior if you are focusing on theories of dog evolution. You might disagree with this, but I'm very happy to discuss it, and I want to provide some data for argument back and forth. The second is that there are many problems of actually how we use this concept of evolution, and especially this frame of co-evolution comes always back in relation to man and human. So I would like to discuss a little bit this issue. What are the problems of using this word if you don't really know what this word is for in biology? And the second is this other main sort of topic that always comes back, whether dog and wolves are different types of animals. I mean, in this sense, the zoological categorization, whether they are the same species or whether they are two separate species. But I might actually leave out this if we don't have so much time, because I'm hoping that Professor Coppinger, we can also extend these issues, and then we can still talk about this later today. So, actually, I just put in this picture because when we talk about domestication, and most of the domestication issues come up in relation to the dog, but actually we have domesticated, if we can say so, many other species. And just how you imagine this process is sometimes very much restricted to these dog-human relationships, but there are other outcomes of this process, and actually I missed all of the plants that we have domesticated, and seemingly those people who are interested in dogs, of course, don't really care about all that other stuff. The other issue is that when we are systemizing the results, what we have achieved through domestications, I mean, from a zoological point of view, there don't seem to be any logic in it. Just if you look at the names that are given to these creatures, especially the Latin names, are quite variable and don't seem to have, I mean, a logic in themselves in it. So this is just to show there is a huge variety of the naming and understanding, and there's not a unified concept already at that level in zoology or in biology in general. And I also have to state here, knowing that some people have different views on the history of the Earth or even history of life on Earth, that of course if you are a biologist, you really have to take the notion of evolution very seriously. And that's why I usually have this citation from Dobzhansky, one of the famous evolutionary biologists, that for a biologist, really, it could be boring, of course, for other people, but if you're a biologist, you always wake up with this concept of evolution, and you have to think in this concept. The only problem is that although biologists think about evolution as a sort of like a rule of that governs our thinking, it's much more difficult to observe how this functions in comparison to other sort of rules, like the rule of the gravity. You can always test rule of gravity. If you don't believe in it, just try to drop this and you will see that gravity works all the time. So you don't have to argue about that. You can argue about how you conceptualize this. But for evolution, the problem is even that we don't have any sort of feeling about how it works. And therefore, it's much easier to make confusing thoughts and confusions with regard to evolution. So, but of course, in the case, that was also a new situation, that with time, actually this concept of domestication evolution was really connected. Although if you read Darwin, you already notice that he makes very lot of connections between evolutionary thinking and the domestication and how producing new animals or plants through domestication or through specific selection of these. So he understood this relationship, but actually if you look at the literature, you find that relatively late were coming people to realize that there is a connection, because both evolution and domestication actually contributes to genetic change, and this genetic change is seen as the main factor or the main phenomena that is connected to that process that we call evolution. So usually I'm referring to Price's definition where he makes this connection between evolution of domestication. The only sort of problem with this definition is, of course, or idea is that he refers to the captive environment, which I don't really understand what he thinks when he talks about the captive environment, because it's a quite complicated issue. And when we talk about dogs especially, and we know that dogs were the first animal to be domesticated, then we don't really see this captive environment for quite a long time. Of course, now you can see that some dogs are living in a captive-like environment. You might not consider your flat or your garden as being a captive, a place where he kept animals in constraint, but nevertheless, this is a sort of a first approach to find out this relationship. And the second is that what is also important, that the changes what we assume taking place during domestication related very much to this captive environment. So basically the animal's genetic makeup has changed in order to make it fit better, survive better in that sort of captive, would like to change it to actually anthropogenic environment, which is probably a much better description of this situation. Now just to have a little bit chance, because I wasn't sure what sort of audience we have and how people understand the concepts behind, but just to make a very little reference to actually how we think about evolution. And this thinking, it's very important to understand that because we don't see it, we have to imagine this. And how people imagine things, they rely on other things that know that they have experience with. So for example, for many, many years, European people, for example, drawing these pedigree trees when they try to explain how a family is dispersing and how the relatives are related to each other and so forth. So this seemed to be a very nice model of describing evolution, and from very early times actually on, people use this tree as a model for evolution. But that's not evolution itself. This is how we imagine that we happen. It can make us to understand processes, but that's not means that processes are actually have this shape or taking place in that way. So what is very important, and because these trees usually have, for example, man at the top, that this is seen very often as a process that had actually a goal. But evolutionary biologists are quite clear about this, that there's no goal, there's no target, there's no aim. This just happens. And second is that this branching, what you can also see here, is actually also somewhat arbitrary. Because if you would go back to that actually this point, there's no such point where the branch actually takes place. People, and I will show in a minute, try to figure out the time of this branching, or even the location on Earth where this branching might have happened, but it's not where you can actually put a piece of stone or a stick there. Now, today, 2 o'clock, take 7 minutes, every goes to the left and these go to the right. So you shouldn't have imagined that. And that's actually a problem, because that's why it's difficult to actually figure out to what extent we could be precise in our models. So some models can incorporate relaxed functioning, others not. This is a quite relaxing. It's not like this, what is portrayed on this figure. But still, in order to make anything that we can talk about, we using these trees format. And the third issue is that, again, I mean, this fitting, this adaptation, I don't want to go into this in detail, but really what you have to understand is something like making the best out of what you have. It's not anything related to being perfect. It's just that trying to make the best. And again, that will or should influence our thinking about the process of evolution. So, actually, when I was preparing for my talk, I was really thinking, what can I say about this any way that is new maybe to the audience, and also, of course, new to myself. So what I suggested is, and also I did a little bit in this direction in my book, was to talk about two stories. One story that was put together by archaeologists over many years, over time. They started probably thinking about these issues like for 100 years ago, maybe even longer, and they are using, of course, this is what you always find in museums and maybe in other collections, trying to use bones remains that are still available. You find them here and there, and somehow deduce this tree, so this relationship between different types of living or dead specimens, and making somehow of this relationship understandable. And now, what happened with the dog, and usually with other creatures as well, actually, is that what you find is not, of course, a whole skeleton. Actually, you don't find the dogs, well, very rare, you can find many skeletons, but what you find is the tiny, tiny pieces. Now, if you find a tiny piece of a bone, how you can decide what it is and how it relates to this variation that has existed at that time? You can be lucky, you can be unlucky. You don't really know why this piece survived and why others might not. Now, where you find them? You find them where you look for them. So it's like, it's like the old joke where you look for your key when there's light because you can see that there. So where archaeologists are active for many other reasons, they might find dog's bone. If they are not active for other reasons, they might not find anything because they don't look for it. So basically the place where you find these bones are coming from places where archaeologists were working, and now people are telling me that the new next boom might actually came from China, because they now invest a lot of money and interest in archaeology in places where there was nothing much before. So we have to take also in account that our knowledge is very much biased in a case of bone remains. The dating method actually is quite worked out. That's not such a problem. And of course, what archaeologists can do, finding a piece of bone or maybe some other pieces, compare it to the recent bones, what we have or what we can have collected. But still, this comparison is not really fair because we have usually a huge amount of recent stuff and we have very little from the old stuff. Now, how you can again make these comparisons? Now, the geneticists, this is a new branch of people. They really have a huge technology behind us. What they really have also usually a lot of money for different reasons, but they have also a biological material that is there in their interest, which is called the DNA. However, what they don't always actually tell us, I mean, if you read the papers, of course, it's in the papers, but this genetic material can have quite different origin. It can come from the nucleus, it can come from a chromosome, the Y chromosome, or it can come from another biological organism, the mitochondrium, which are not the same. I mean, chemically they look very much the same, but biologically they are quite different. So they're using different materials, and their evolution, their genetic change might be also different. Now, they also collect by accident, basically, their DNA, more or less. So I know, I do it as well sometimes, that if a student comes to me, can I go for a few weeks to South Asia? They said, well, you can go, but you take your little collecting material with you, and please collect dog DNA from wherever you find the dog, and on your plate. Maybe that's actually sometimes too late, actually, or if you meet them on the streets, and so forth. So the idea here is that collecting of this DNA is again more or less accidental, and that could influence what you are getting out of this. Then the geneticists have this idea that the change, what happens during the evolution, so the genetic change on which the whole argument is based on, is actually happens to a standard rate. Basically, you can say the mutation rate is standard or doesn't change. Now, whether it's true or not, that's another issue. The problem, of course, especially with those species that evolved very recently, this is probably not really true and has to be corrected for. So that's again an issue that the way how they do the calculations, and I don't go into this direction, it's not so interesting for us at the moment, as you will see, but there's also a lot of statistical mystery in them. So again, I mean, we have to be careful how serious we take this. And again, but this is not so popular, but it will become more popular to compare DNA from recent specimens with old specimens. The only problem with this old DNA is that you can't really go very long back in time because the DNA gets degraded and then you can't really use this method anymore. So you can see, I mean, just in a short table that there are huge problems of in both methods, so neither is better than the other, and probably what people would suggest is try to combine these two methods in order to have a clearer picture. Now, what is the clear picture? Here is what looked for some papers that show some results. Some of them are debated, and I think I'm not an expert in archaeology, and maybe some other contributors might want to comment on some of these specimens later. But what I just want to indicate it here is the assumed date of domestication that was more or less deduced from this finding, and of course where the find was, where they found the bone piece, that's indicated here, and these are just the authors. If you look at this picture, what you can see is actually, I think, two things. One is that probably we don't really find bones very early in the Australian continent, in the American continent, and maybe some other parts of the world that have been separated, so most remains come from the European and Asian part of the continent. That's one. The second is that if you look at these dates, which is before present, basically what you have is from let's say the latest is 12,000 and the earliest is 32,000, so you have the range for about, let's say, 20,000 years. This is you can also call it an error margin, basically, or a deviation. So some people say dogs were domesticated as early as 23 or as late as 12,000. So you have actually quite a huge time. And just remember that our culture that we sort of know a little bit about is, let's say, less than 10,000 years. So it's already this error, what we have here, is double of that what we have known for as human beings, really understanding the world in this way. And so is there a conflict between the genetics and what the geneticists tell you and the archaeologists tell you? In my view, actually not. Because if you look at the results of the genetic research, is sort of quite similar. So this is a bit more papers and a longer list. You don't have to really look at these columns, because these are the authors. This is just that they are using different types of DNA. This is again where they suggest the domestication took place. This is of course based on some comparative evaluation and genetic diversity. It should not really concern us at the moment. But again, you will find the same suggestions. Dogs came or have been domesticated or were domesticated either in sort of Europe, Near East parts or a little bit south from Europe, or somewhere in Asia, probably more likely China, whether south or east or that's not so important for the moment. If you look at the dates, what they come up with, you can actually get the same range of dates. So either 11,000, which is the sort of late domestication. Some people seem to read out this value from their DNA data. Other people are more brave. We take just out this 100,000 years ago for the moment. But anyway, so they go say that it's 32,000. So actually, if you look at these papers, I think that we learned something. I don't say that we are there where we were 50 years ago, but because of this huge divergence in possible dates, I don't see at the moment anything that would help us to understand more precisely that actual time of the branching and also maybe where this branching has taken place. So my very simple, realistic story is like that. So this is the timeline. We are somewhere now here. We are now here today, actually, the sparse conference here by 0. And then this is the range that you have to consider. Now, this is which people gave, both geneticists and genetic and archaeological evidence point that dogs must have been domesticated somewhere here and at some point here. And you can see that the breed divergence, just as a comparison, so the last 500 years compared to that region happened somewhere here. So really, whether somebody would say that dogs are domesticated here or here or here, at the moment, for me, does not make much difference. Doesn't mean, because actually, if you look at that, we will also, some people probably will mention this experiment where Russian researchers actually selected for tame behavior in foxes. They did they achieved, although it was a very targeted selection, a very large effect, or a relatively large effect, within 40 years. So if I say, not 40, let's have 1,000 years, which probably you can calculate with 2,000 generations, then it's a huge amount of time. You could do probably, genetically speaking, anything, even if you don't have a targeted selection on that population of animals or many population of animals. So, and 1,000 years, you can have it 30 times here, or at least 25 times. So it doesn't make any sense to say, okay, now we know that they were domesticated here. We probably will never know that with that precise date and place. But for me, that's already interesting to know that, okay, they were domesticated at that range, and some were. But the other issue about this where is also, for me, a little bit of a mystery. Because just imagine that during this time, people actually much earlier, people we know that were trading. There was a lot of trading going on. It's not by airplanes. It doesn't take 1 hour or 9 hours, like for me to come from Europe to Seattle and so on. So it might have to take longer, but we have time. We have many 10,000 years to trade in that way. So if you have already an animal which we know from other experiences that people very rapidly realize what sort of relationship they could have with an animal like a dog, I'm sure that they will trade with it, which means that they would give it to other people in exchange from some other goods. So again, there's a huge amount of time to actually disperse dogs if it's a good thing, and among various communities. I always say, actually, maybe it's more like it's more like a joke. It's actually a joke that dogs are the first product of the people, and it's one of the best products because it's still on the market. And that's what I did trade through. So people realize that. And one story from the Australian is, from the Aboriginal, is that when they lived for the dingo for a very long time, but when they met first the real dogs, so to speak, from the Europeans, they realized that these animals have much to offer. And then that's actually for a problem for people who try to study the original life between the dingo and the Aboriginals, that now they are much happier having the European dogs with them. So people can see the value, so to speak, this interspecific attraction in dogs and humans. So I think trade could play an important role. Now, the problem, of course, is that if this was the situation, again, to decide where the dogs are coming from is actually quite a hard job, given that our tools, whether it's an archaeological tool or a genetic tool, are actually very crude at the moment. And I think the most important selective feature, so why dogs or some wolves became dogs, was the human. And for me, again, it's not really about a huge importance whether those humans were actually hunter-gatherers, or they were living in villages, or they were actually not living in villages, or they were living for 1,000 years as hunter-gatherers, then they tried a little bit of agriculture, then they failed, and they went back, and whatever happened. Because, again, there was a huge time things could happen in various ways. And for me, it's very difficult to see how we ever can get a story that would be not debated in another paper in the next months or in a short time to come. Actually, that's what you can also see now if you are following the published papers in Nature, that people don't seem to agree on some things which for me as a biologist would be important to know, but apparently just our tools are not ready or not ready yet. Okay, so the second topic that I want to sort of discuss is this coevolution. And also, I try not to make this error, but I admit it's very easy to make this error. So I'm not saying that those people who are trying about coevolution are not reading literature, they are not really careful and so on. It's just because the notion of this between evolution and having these two species living together so friendly for many years gives you this impression that they must be co-evolving. When you think that is something sort of together, you use this meaning. Now, this is, for example, just a text from two sources. One is from the paper by Schleiter and Schalter, talking about coevolution of humans and canids. And the basic idea is here that humans who met the wolf, early humans, they learned from the wolf some aspects of using territory, some aspects of hunting, and some other aspects of even social life and so forth, cooperation, and or even having a house or a fixed place where to live and so on. So it's a quite brave and bold paper about that sort of information exchange or experience exchange between the two species, and they put it in this framework of coevolution. There is a lot of things are published now about genetic findings in dogs, and this is a text from the internet. I just put in the word coevolution in Google and copied out the first text I found. And here is a report that actually was then written by the Washington Post, saying that now we have new evidence that dogs and humans co-evolved. And actually it's very interesting that when you read the text, you can see important words, which we will now can really show that this is not coevolution actually, is that basically what happens is, and this was connected with this idea, what probably most people know about these TARC genes, whether dogs can digest TARCs because of coevolution or because of the evolutionary change that actually happened in their life. So this journalist said that, and based on other sources, that the same evolutionary change, so actually that we can digest TARC and dogs can digest TARC, so the same change happened about the same time, and this is what they regard as a phenomenon of coevolution. Now, if you actually look at the definition of coevolution, this is not what is the case. So evolution, I already mentioned, is something when the allele frequencies change, so the genetic frequencies are changing. But for coevolution, there's a specific definition available in the literature, which most people actually agree with, is that where we have one species that exerts a specific effect of the other species in an evolutionary time, and then this has another response, or we find another response to that in the first species. So basically, coevolution means something where there's a reciprocal adaptation, if you like, or change from in one species and in the other species. So both species have to change in order, in a frame where this change was caused, more or less, or caused, yes, by the other species. So if you want to have example of a nice example of what biologists might like or understand as a form of coevolution is this case with the newt and the greater snake, where actually what you have here is a prey and a predator, and the predator is using a poison to kill the prey, and of course the prey wants to protect itself by producing a poison. Now the problem with here is that in order to avoid predation, you might produce a poison that is poisonous for the predator. So basically what happens is that newts have developed or evolved very strong poisons, and actually if you now look at this situation, you can find that the poison produced by a newt is actually much, much more powerful than actually what would be needed in this situation just to protect yourself. So, and this could be framed in that sort of a cycle where you have the two species interacting. This is evolutionary time, so many, many years in this case, where the one species has an effect on the other, so here we have predation, and the other will evolve a defense mechanism, of which is, okay, working well, but as a response to this action, the predator will evolve a resistance. So now the predators are resistant to that sort of toxin or the amount of toxin. And then, as a response, they will be continuing predating on that for the prey species. However, as a response, now the prey species will actually evolve a better poison, and so on and so forth. So basically, this is how what we understand as coevolution, because each species have an effect somehow on the other, and this effect is actually quite specific. So it's not a general effect just being together in the same environment. It's quite specific and leads to specific changes in behavior, morphology, or other phenotypes. So this is how you should understand more or less the logic of coevolution. Now, if you want to see what happens with the case of the dog, I mean, I try to make sort of a story out of what Schleid and his co-workers were suggesting. So that would be the description of the story put forward by Wolfgang Schleid on coevolution of man and dog or wolf, basically. So here we have the wolves, and here we have the humans, and then these wolves were hunting and following the herds, and humans were observing that more or less, and were copying that behavior. So humans were, I mean, according to them, became hunters because they learned from wolves how to hunt on large game. And because of this living together, now some wolves might decided to join human groups. And again, this joining of human groups might have some effect on humans. I mean, they might change our social behavior. In some respect, maybe humans became more social or more understandable towards other types of creatures. So that could be also assumed based on this model. And basically, we also increased or improved our communication, which also resulted in a change in the communication of the wolf, and so on and so forth. So the idea is what Schleid also suggests here, that it's not only the wolf that has changed, and it's important in a specific way, and also genetically, because without genetics you don't have evolution, but also the humans had changed genetically as an actual response to that encounter with the wolf. Or I also found actually a quite brave hypothesis, which was also commented by, at that time, by Mark Beckhoff and criticizing this idea. But I mean, again, it's important that I always say that even if people might be not right, it's very important that they understand what and how they talk about some scientific models. So here, what you have here is this a model from Paxton, where he assumed, at least in this paper in 2000, that this cohabitation of wolves and humans also allowed for the wolves having a better, because we assume that wolves have a better smelling ability, finding prey, and so on, and maybe humans capitalized on this ability by living together with these animals. And that could actually cause humans to having a change in their olfactory ability, actually a sort of, I call it a shorter nose, so basically changing the way how we breathe air and how we use our airflow. And actually these anatomical changes could actually help humans in develop, or actually but probably evolve speech, and this would be the effect. So basically you can see, I mean, if you want to have a bottom line, we can speak because we live together with wolves and dogs. Actually, that's not a bad idea sometimes, that we have the possibility to talk to our dog, but probably this is not the reason for that it's not the reason that we actually living together for many 10,000 years with them. So the problem here is what I see is really that, again, but the main assumption is that the effect of dogs or these wolves should be a genetic effect that made genetic changes in the human in humans, and of course, as a consequence, we changed also our phenotype in a specific way. So. So this is just in a summary. So basically the idea is that when you assume dog-human coevolution, you have to go through these steps. The first step is some change in one species. That's we could assume. We can talk about this, whether it's genetic, to what extent it is genetic, to what extent it is specifically genetic. But it's another issue. Then what we would expect is a second event. Now in the other species, in our case is this us. So what is the specific human behavior and skill that has been selected for since we were living together with the dogs. And then the third step maybe, and of course this could go longer, but I just picked the first 3 steps. What you can also see here is the question about, okay, now how this change affected, and whether it's affected at all, behavior or the genotype and the phenotype of the dogs. So if we don't have evidence for this chain of events, we should not really talk about coevolution as used by biologists in general terms. So in order to help with this issue, I came up with some other framing which might help or might not. So one is that we just forget about the word coevolution and we talk about something what you say is a cohabitation. So it's a neutral term. You can also say sometimes parallel evolution. So basically each species is evolving in its own way, but they share some part of their niche, some part of their environment, and maybe some very general effect. Maybe this evolution, these changes also, of course, affect generally the evolution of the other, but there's no specific connection between these two, between the events, evolutionary events that happen in one species and those that happen in the other species. So in this, if you want to have the same framework for that, you can also see here that we have the wolves and the humans here, and of course there's interaction. So and you will hear about this later. Dogs might, or these wolves might, exploiting food sources of humans. Humans might actually protect them or provide protection in many respect, and then maybe some animals join even the community. They are much closer ties now between humans and dogs, and humans even actually they might change the way how they communicate, but whatever happens here, you don't really have a very marked change in human genetic setup. You might change even the human phenotype. Phenotype changes that not necessarily are converted in genetic changes and so forth. So basically what we have here, 2 species living together for a long time, and maybe even if they have benefits of some time, this might not be or is not necessarily an evolutionary interaction. Now you can also imagine in another model where you can use the word of coevolution, but you need an adjective for this. And this adjective would be, in this case, a cultural. So that means that it's still about, there's no genetic change involved in that, but the phenotype of the humans that we have, or at some point we had, might have been really affected. And we can recognize this by adding the word cultural, which is more about a phenotypic change and not necessarily a genetic change. So, and this is basically the same slide than before, so I didn't change too much. The only thing what I actually changed, and again, that might be considered, but it's very difficult to really show, and I try to read along this line from many authors. I'm still not convinced, but I can imagine that this could be a great contribution, that in some specific evolutionary or just history situations, the fact that people had dogs allowed them to make larger advances compared to the situation if they wouldn't have dogs living together. So especially, for example, I can imagine people conquering northern part of the globe, going to the north, having loads carry around instead of just they have to carry it for themselves. Dogs could help carry them, not necessarily by a sledge, but just other ways and so on. So dogs could also be a form of food. I know people don't really like this idea, but we have to understand that some situations actually people really were eating dogs, and that might also help them in many cases, because compared to dogs, dogs can be regarded as a food source, and they can be surviving without food relatively long. So it's a living food source for a relatively long time. So in many situations, really the presence of dogs could help, and this could make human culture or technology advancing. So I can imagine that in that sense, really you can talk about this coevolution. The only problem, of course, with with this theory is that it's very difficult to find any sort of proof. And this is because what I mentioned at the beginning of the trading. Because people, there's no control population. So wherever you go on Earth, I mean, you have always humans and dogs living together. And even in the history, probably dogs disperse very rapidly. So we don't really have this control experiment. What would have happened if there have been no dogs around? Or did those humans worse in any situations where they ignored the dogs or they didn't care with the dogs? Of course, we have now different situations, people living with dogs together, and that cohabitation is sometimes actually quite disadvantageous and so on, but today this is a totally different situation. So it's very difficult to see how this could be happening many thousand years ago. So basically what I wanted to say here is that we think about, that's again my opinion, of course, so we can discuss this later, about dog-human relationship as a situation of parallel evolution, species living side by side for many years, occasionally interacting in a way affecting the phenotype of both species, but the big difference is that a human effect on the dogs could or incorporates also genetic effects. So the phenotypic changes in dogs are related very much to changes in the genetic, while on the other hand, we don't really have this on the human side, or at least it's very difficult to prove that any change what took place in humans was actually because we shared our life with the dogs. So, but if you want to have this aspect of coevolution or the effect of dogs on humans, I would not deny that dogs might have an effect of the cultural evolution in our species. So the last bit of this is a little bit about this discussion about is a dog a wolf or is wolf a dog, and I'm so happy to see in the scientific papers that you have all sorts of approaches and all sorts of variations and arguments, especially because in the scientific papers you always have to use the Latin name of the species that you are studying, at least once in the beginning of the paper. And if now it seems to be that there are sort of groups of papers, some using the sort of official version, which would be making this relationship between dog and wolf very close, and others are using the traditional, let's say this way, naming where the wolves and dogs are kept separate. And where this whole thing originates from is this Swedish guy called Carl Linne, who actually was the first who tried to systemize what at that time was known about animals and plants. Now, what is again important to understand, if you remember the tree, that this is something what happens to you if you want to make an order on your desk. Okay, so now it's a huge amount of work. I mean, papers, books everywhere. And now you decide it's summer, you have some time, you go home, and then you put everything in boxes, and there's a logic. Now, the problem with this is that if you do it very fast, and if you do it in one afternoon, at least that happens to me, then you will forget it next day, the logic, because there was another logic before for many months that this book is always there. There's no logic, but I remember. Now it's a logic that this book is now here because you want to use the alphabetic order, but you totally forget, because there would be another logic to have dog books and dolphin books or whatever. So this naming is just putting things in boxes. And it's good because you can find something if you have a good logic, but there are many different types of logic that you can use. So actually for Linne, and you have to know also actually that this logic will depend very much on your knowledge at the present time. So actually he probably looked at dogs and wolves and decided that they look quite different from each other. So probably it's good to have them in one box, the dog, and the one box, the wolf, but there are quite similarities between the two. So they kept the same name to some extent. You remember the first is the genus name, and then you have the species name. So basically canis refers to that they are sort of similar, but you had the other name to saying that they are different. And this is the English version, so the gray wolf would be, the wolf would be for the canis, and the lupus would be for the gray. I mean, it's not a translation, it's just the same indication when you're using your native language for explaining the same box coding. It's interesting, actually, that compared to other animals, I mean, domesticated animals, the familiarity is also only used in the case of the dog, which I find interesting. That this expresses also this close relationship with people, and already Linne used that expression. Now, some other issues come in, and I want to skip that really. Is here that some people thought that you can have other type of boxes. Basically, you make another system. You having also not just the genus name and the species name, but also subspecies name. So you could actually come up with 3 names, and this would be now more or less the official name for the Eurasian gray wolf, and then it would be the official name for the dogs if you decide that there is a box where the dog and the wolf belong together. Now, actually, at the same time, if you remember where Linne was working, that was the end of the 18th century, middle of the 18th century. In the same time, already in England, John Hunter was thinking about that maybe, and what he say, observations tending to show that wolf, jackal, dogs are of the same species. So it seems to be that Hunter might have another type of boxes, and he suggested that these should come together, mainly actually because by that time there was evidence that these species or the member of these species could interbreed. So, and that was seen as a very critical thing for putting things in different, or animals in different boxes. If they could interbreed, they should belong to the same box. If they couldn't, you might have the right to put them in separate boxes. Now, so what I would argue, and again, it's argument for the discussion later on, that if you look at dogs and wolves in detail, you really see that they diverged quite recently. So it's not a huge time. I mean, this 15,000 or 20,000 in evolution times is nothing. So it's just a very short time. But what happened to them is actually a quite marked change. So for example, yes, they separated not too long ago, but actually looking at the ecology, they are quite separate today. And the fact that there are so many dogs and wolves even living more or less freely, despite of this fact, you don't really find strong hybridization. So biologically, they can hybridize, but they don't do it in nature. So they seem to be keeping their separate life, they life separate, and they keep to breed with their own. Another thing is that we also see there are marked morphological and also behavior changes between dogs and wolves, and probably others will come talk about these issues as well. So again, I mean, that would also suggest that these 2 animal species should actually go into different boxes. And also that the fact that when you allow dogs, I mean, even today, or 10,000 years ago, or now 5,000 years ago, to live alone and without any human contact, then you don't see that they actually sort of becoming wolves. And this natural experiment have been done, what is now we know about the dingo. So the dingo is, or has been probably started on that road for domestication, but then were driven away, and they didn't become wolves. So again, the genetic change that was occurring at the beginning of domestication is still somehow there in that sense. So I think really that dogs can be regarded as a separate species for many reasons, and this argument I also wanted to try to put in, or is in my book, and it's because actually they are living in a different environment, even if you see them sort of close to each other. I mean, the wolves and the dogs in many places, they collecting different experience, they having different social systems, and I think why this is very important also, because what I said at the beginning, this categorization depends a little bit also on the scientist and where you separate these boxes. Now, why I find this important? Because when we are saying that dogs and wolves belong to the same species, we incorporate that problem that behaviorally they are the same. So probably all the things what we know and will know and have known about the wolves are applied also to the dogs. And I know that probably most of you know about these ideas specifically in, for example, in dog training. And I think if we would say, just from a practical point of view, that no, dogs is a different species, and this different species came to existence because humans were also existing at that time. So basically, you can say that the species came to existence as a response, as an evolutionary response to humans. Then we don't have to bother about all these problems. Okay, how is the pack organization in a wolf? What is there about dominance and subordinate? Why? What happens to the wolves? What is a wolf family? Is it a family at all? And so on, because that, although it's a not distant relative in evolutionary terms, it's a different species. So I think that argument, which might of course be debated by others, could actually give some practical help for people arguing that actually we should now not look at the wolf as the sort of the ideal dog or whatever, but we should look at our dogs and learn from them and use this information for making a better life and an improved life. So I think in this way we can really having a much better argument for those people who have not much experience with biology, zoology, who just hear here and there that actually when you look at the West Highland Terrier or even a Corgi or whatever, it's just like a wolf, because the DNA, when you compare them, and this is of course true, is just a little difference between those two species. And these people then realize, oh my God, this is a wolf, so what should I do with them? Even it's white and small and doesn't look like it, but it's still a one. So I think, and that if people have this problem, I mean, looking at a dog like a wolf, then I think they also get frustrated because they don't understand it. So it's difficult to see, because when we want, whether we want or not, actually the notion of the wolf in most people comes from other stories and so on. So they don't really understand in that, even in a biological and ethological way, if you like. So for this reason, I think that on one side it's very important to argue in this direction, and I usually what I can argue, but also what you can also do is, of course, study both species and comparing them. And I think we will also talk about this more or less here, but you can also find some literature on this, and this is why I really found very interesting that you have studies on the wolves as in a nature or in a semi-captive environment, understanding their social behavior, learning skills, and many aspects of their life. But what is also important, of course, but only from the scientific point of view, that you have a comparative work where you can really compare dogs and wolves in a very narrow way, and with the aim of really looking at the differences and similarities. And this is what we have done in Budapest, for example, and I don't really have time to go into. I also didn't plan to go into, because this was not a topic of that, but I just want to show you a few pictures actually from this experiment that we done over, let's say, about 5 to 8 years in Budapest, where we really raised dogs and also wolf puppies in a very intensive socialized way. So both received the same amount of exposure. Both member of species had the same intensive social care from very early on, separated from their mothers. And then you can see that and even the owners, so the wolves, were the same as the owners of the dogs for some years at least. We could then, so we tried to make the social experience for both species very similar. And here are some other pictures from, you can see that there is also, you can even celebrate the Christmas with a wolf, although it's a quite short Christmas, because the tree falls over very soon. But what is also important, this red text might not read it so well, but still, it's especially in many people want to go home and experiment on having a wolf puppy and so on. So that was again done under scientific surveillance and control and so on. So you should not repeat this experiment in any way, I think, because wolves should be living there where they're born and so on. But at least you can show that having this social exposure to these animals, you exposing the wolf to a human environment actually can make huge changes in their behavior. So usually in nature you don't find wolves that you can have on leash and walk with them and so on. But still we believe, and our experiments have shown in many cases, and I might talk about this tomorrow a little bit, that really you can still, despite these social exposure, you can still find differences in dog and wolf behavior, what for me suggests that we really having here two separate species. I'm just thinking about maybe I still have a little time to go rapidly over this argument, because this fits very well also as a closing notion of this talk about domestication. And this is what we are sort of working on for a time now, and still not probably very happy with the outcome, that trying to frame how dog and wolf differences could be portrayed in a very simple model, what I call the synergic hypothesis about the effect of domestication. And many people seem to, one reason actually why I'm telling you this, that I really want to have a feedback on that, and hopefully we can discuss whether this model is useful or not useful, and in what respect. But I think what it needs to be understood here, that it's important to see that this model is about domestication in a sense, and in what aspect the ancient wolf, so to speak, had to be changed in order to have a dog at the end of this long and complicated process. And I think that humans in that case were not really selecting for, and that's what I'm saying at the beginning, they didn't have a specific goal. So I think early humans didn't have the idea that, well, how nice it would be that I could go with a hunt on that creature, or if he would help me to do this and that, or pull my sledge and so on. So it was a much sort of natural process. It was not really a product making. People were not thinking together, making a sort of brainstorming. Oh, we have this creature around. What ideas what you do with this and how we can do it? No, I mean it was a much natural approach. So I think the one key issue is that what I also see actually in many recent dog-human interactions is having an animal that is sort of working in a nice way, and I don't have to invest so much time in this interaction. So it's sort of an easygoing living together. And I know that there are many dog trainers here, and I also have seen this video at the beginning showing that you need a dog trainer. Actually, if you would be really in a problem if everyone who has now a dog, I think there are about 50 million dogs in the US, and everyone would call now today, I need a dog trainer, 50 million dogs, you won't be able to provide a service. I mean, it's very good that most people don't need the dog trainer, and they don't need the dog trainer because dogs are good products. If you're buying a washing machine, you don't call the man there, okay, I need somebody to help me. Because that washing machine, that would be a very bad product if you need somebody to help you with how to do the washing or so on. I mean, the laptops computers are not so good products. You need much more help for them. But companies try to do that, solve this problem also. So I think dogs are good products. They're working without dog trainers. Some are not. Okay, that's fine. But I think generally they don't even have dog trainers 10,000 years ago because people don't care about that. Jesus had this natural interaction and they had the happy life, more or less. If they didn't have the happy life, then selection was there to solve the problem, okay? Now, this model goes in this direction. So basically what I want to suggest is very simple, is that the idea is here that basically you have and that's basically a model. You have the two, let's say, species, dogs and wolves, and then you have three types of environments. And these three types of environments are one where there's no human, so no socialization. There is what I saw, a typical socialization, so nothing specific. You get your puppy, you live with your puppy, you enjoy the dog, and the dog enjoys you, and everything is going well. And then, of course, what you can have is an intensive interaction. That means, more social, living together, dog training, whatever you like to do, and so on. So these are the three levels. Of course, these are arbitrary levels. I mean, this is the model. And then what you have here is a very simple graph. So basically, it's saying age, time, again, without anything here, and then a social trait that you can measure. And this is, of course, the measurement is, again, arbitrary. So now I say that this dotted line just suggests that this means that this level of the social trait, the performance, is working. So I'm happy with my dog, okay? If I'm saying my dog, he does it. If I want them to do it, I want them to not do that, not doing anything that he's not doing it. So I'm happy living together with my dog. So this is the performance level. And now what I'm saying, or the model says, is that if you have the dogs and the wolves compared, then the dogs have some sort of selective advantage. So they start at, let's say, I mean, this is of course arbitrary because they have to be born first, but they start basically in advance. So the dog value, if you could measure it, but you don't because that's before birth, this here, the wolf is there. Now what you can do is that if you give the wolf the normal social environment, by normal the everyday, the typical environment, they will reach this performance relatively rapidly. Then when you give them an intensive environment, that will be not much change. Actually, there's not much experiments going in this direction, but probably they might be faster, better, whatever, but it is basically the same. And if you have the wolf at home, so this is an experiment that you should not do, then of course, if you raise the wolf just as if you raise a dog, then what happens would be that the wolf's performance might increase, but actually they might not reach this imaginary threshold. If, however, you give the wolf a very intensive social care interaction, they might actually pass the threshold, usually with some delay. So actually, in that sense, you can socialize the wolf. So there's not an argument that wolves are not animals, they are social animals. They can be socialized, but your efforts are much bigger when you socialize a wolf in comparison to the dog. So basically what domestication did was to make this effort smaller in general. And I think this is maybe a helpful frame in which we can compare dogs and wolves. And some people say that, okay, that means that dogs are faster, earlier doing this performance. And I say, yes, in this case, in this model, it suggests that some specific aspects of their social behavior emerge earlier when they are socialized in a typical way with humans in comparison to the wolf. Okay, I just want to leave you with this idea, and thank you for listening. And as you will see, at the end of all my talks, you will see my daughter's dog, a Sheltie, who always accompanies me in that two-dimensional format. Thank you very much.